Hi everyone, my name is Jean-Christophe. In this beginner Python tutorial, I'm going to show you one of the most useful skills you can have in your Python tool sets when you start programming, and that is debugging your code. Inevitably, you will end up with some code errors at some point, and you want to be able to look at this and know what to do. So the first step I'm going to show you is I created a code with that create an error, and I'm going to show you what happens here. I'm ending up with what we call the traceback, and you want to be able to read that traceback and be able to debug it because you're going to see that a lot of time. So when you read this, I made you a small visualization that can help you. Is you start reading from the bottom to the top. And the first thing that you look at is the name, the exceptions names that you're seeing. And right there, I'm getting the name error. And I have some information that says name is not defined. This gives me a hint that I haven't defined a variable somewhere. And I want to look further. And I start from the file with the actual error. So I can see that code with error.py has this function, which is make hello, which I call there in my code. So the higher you are in your traceback, the closer you are to what you executed. So you first executed this, make hello, and then in order to execute this, you call a function that is found in your code with error right there. And I could potentially go back to my code with error, and I can see that the name variable was not defined. So that's how you try to debug your traceback. You also have the line number where it happens and a lot of useful information. Now you want to learn the main exception types. What kind of exceptions will you encounter in your life? What kind of errors? And they fall back into three main categories. And those main categories are the syntax errors, the exceptions, and the logical errors. Why they have these categories is because they're not going to behave the same way. If you have a syntax error, nothing will work. Code will break and the code block will not be running at all. It will just throw the error instantly. And how you get that syntax error is if I do while true, for example, and I say print 1. In that case, it would print 1 forever, but since I forgot my column here, then I throw a syntax error and nothing else can work. You have the exceptions and you have the logical errors. The exception is a bit different, is that it won't break because of a syntax error, but when you try to do it during runtime, it will break. So if you try to do a zero division error, for example, zero division, so 9 divided by 0, inevitably you will get a zero division error. But the code could run because if I come back here to my while true and I say print I, like I want to print I right above here, you can see that it didn't print the letter I before running, but if I put it above my runtime execution, then I can see that it printed the I first, but then returned the zero division error. And that's what we mean by runtime error. As for logical error, it will not throw any error, like exceptions, like the syntax or the runtime errors, but it will have your code won't behave as what you would have expected. So one common example is if I have a equal 5 and b equal 10, and what I want to do is I want to sum a plus b and then multiply by 2. One thing that you might happen is a logical error. So I will print that logical error. So let's say I want to do 5 plus 10 times 2. I do a plus b times 2. If I run this, I end up with a problem because 5 plus 10 times 2 is supposed to be 30, and in this case it's 25. And the reason because that is because it did 5 plus 10 times 2, so it did 25. So if I want to fix that logical error, what I need to do is simply put in parentheses like you would do in math, and then you have your fixed errors. Now that we went into the main categories of errors, there are multiple exceptions that you will encounter in your life. If you want to show all the types of exception, you can do print dir locals and then say dundernet built-ins dunder. So what you'll get here, you will have a list of all the possible syntax errors. But I'm gonna cover the top 10 most common exceptions that you will encounter. The first thing, and we already mentioned this, is the syntax error. And the syntax error will happen with if. It will happen if blocks, try and except blocks, while blocks, and for I in range blocks. And the way this often happens is if you forgot to put your column right there and you try to do so. If A equals B, and then you try to print A equals B, then you try this, and that's what we just saw. It happens all the time. Whenever you forgot a column, this is one of the things that you'll see the most often. This happens also when you have a string and you want to forget to put the closing string element unclosed. So if I try to do this, I will have an exception, syntax error that says you haven't terminated your string literal detected at line 2. And as you can see, that error, I always start with the name and then I see some information and I didn't even go up because I knew it was because it wasn't closed. It's easy. Over time, you get a sense of those errors and you spot them instantly. Another big potential errors that you will encounter is the indentation error. The indentation error happens when you haven't indented your block. And this is very important because Python forces you to have some syntax to follow up, and if you don't, it will break. So it forces you to have that indentation, and in this case, otherwise you get indentation error. In order to fix this, you just add a tab and then press, and it works. Otherwise, you have other situation when you define a function and you have something that is print properly indented. And when you don't follow always the same indentation, right now VS Code just tells me that it's okay. It just puts it automatically there. But let's say I try to do it manually or I paste code from somewhere else and like somebody made that error and you have uneven, and then this will throw an indentation error. And as you can see, I didn't even have to try to call the function for this to break because it is part of the syntax error. Python wants you to have a proper syntax. It makes you a better programmer because it makes your code beautiful, but it does throw some of these exceptions. Let's say I see the third biggest culprit is a value error. So if you try to convert, for example, a string to an int, like that works, right? You can change a number one to a number one in integer. But if you try to do this by changing a string, then you will have an exception that breaks because you're actually trying to change text to an integer, which doesn't work. It can also happen if you do a float and then you have a string that is 3 0.2, 0.2. Like if you have this, how do you convert this to a float? You cannot convert it because there's two dot notation. Another very common use case is if you have a package, and that happens all the time. You get code, you import it from a tutorial that you found online, and then they ask you to import request HTML, and then you try to run it, and you have ModuleNotFoundError. Um, the only way to fix this, the simple way to fix this is to just do a pip install. So generally you have the pip install and you have your requests HTML, for example. And you just run this in your terminal and you would fix your error. There are other kind of imports that can break. So if you try to import Panda, for example, but you call it Pandu, you're going to have this same error. If you do import Panda, and that's very important because you want your casing to be always pandas like normal with the proper import would be pandas. So you have to fix your casing. And it will not tell you what the error is, but you can spot it by the wrong casing here. You will get index error as well. So here I have three values. So I can take my list and index 0, and I will get the first item of my list. But what if I take an item that is larger than the list has? Then I can see list index out of range. That happens very, very, very often. Another exception that you will face is when you are trying to make a reference of something that does not exist. So if you try to append the number 4 to the list, then you will have my list will work. But if you try to do add 5, let's run this, it works. So if I return my list, it works fine. What if I try to add F5 to the letter? It doesn't work because add is not a method that you can use on a list item, and you will get the attribute error. Next, let's get into the type errors. And type errors can happen very, very often. And in this case, how we're going to fix this is you take your result and when you try to match a string to an integer, for example, you have a mismatch type and that will break. One thing that you can do is you could say convert this to a string instead, and you would fix your type error. There are other issues when you try to index something that is not indexable. So you take this and you try to get the index 0 from an integer. You cannot do this, but you would be able to do it on a string, for example. So that's one of the cases. If you try to call a non-callable object. So remember, when you want to do a call a function, you just use this notation. But if you try to do this on a list, you will get the type error, list object is not callable. Also, if you have a variable that is equal none, and then you try to append something or make a calculation on it plus equal 5, then you will get this type error too. You have other situation when you have incompatible types comparison. I won't go into too much detail. They're all variable that happens. One that happens very often is when you try to assign a value and you get the unhashable type list. This is come up very often. And when you have a type mismatch, integer equal 3.14. Earlier, we talked about the name error, and that's very simple. If I try to call my variable, I never created that variable. VS Code is very smart. It just tells me what it's in white. I can see it easily that it does not even exist. So if I run it, I automatically get the name error, and that's when you never defined it. So if you say my variable equals 5, and then you call my variable, as you can see, the variable became blue and it doesn't break anymore. Next, we have IO error. This happens a little less, but it generally happens when you try to open a file that does not exist, non-existent file.txt, and I just try to do as f, and I do content, or even just f read. So if I try to read that file, I get a file not found error, which is essentially an IO error. You'll see, depending on your version, you might see both. The next error that you will see is the key error. And this occurs when you have a dictionary and you try to access a key that doesn't exist. So let's take that dictionary, and I want to select the letter A, the key A. I will be able to return the letter 1, but let's say if I try to access a key that does not get, then I can see key error and it doesn't exist. If you want to prevent those runtime errors that we discussed, like this, you're trying to print 1 divided by 0, you can use try and except. So you use try and except print the what an error. So as you can see here, we used to have a 0 division error, but now it works properly, didn't throw an error, didn't break anything. If I want to do something else, it will still work. Print something, it will still print it, but it returns the error. If you want to go further and have a better knowledge of what's going on, then you can do exception as E, and then you raise. So what will happen is that we'll store the exception name into your E variable, and then you can show it the error, and then you see it, the try and except return there was an error and gave you what the error was. Which is super useful in your code to handle all the potential exceptions. And that's it. So we covered almost everything we need to know for the most common use cases where you encounter error. Feel free to subscribe to my channel or visit my blog on jcchouinard.com, and feel free to like and subscribe. Bye.